Welcome to Answering Difficult Interview Questions. This is an interview skills webinar featuring Shane Farrell and myself, Keith O'Malley. We're both work within Career Support and Law Society. Shane, you might say hello.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am support administrator here in the Law Society of Ireland. Hope you enjoyed the webinar today. Hope you get something interesting from it. And remember, we are available at all stages for any sort of queries or anything like that. You can email me at s.farrell@lawsociety.ie. Thanks, Keith.
Okay, great. We're going to cover an awful lot of questions today, but before we do that, I'm just going to start. Shane, we got a lot of feedback or an echo on you there, so I'm a bit concerned about that. So let me just talk for a little bit and see how things settle in. What we're going to do here is we're going to talk about three different things before we go into answers to difficult questions. These are three things that are important for all interviews, and they're also things that you should very much take into account as you're developing answers and try and bed these matters into your answers and make sure that your answers have regard for these matters. So the first one is the job. What you need to do is, in as far as possible, when you're at an interview, is talk about the job. Talk about what's important in the job and how you might do the job in order to provide really good value to your employer and to other stakeholders, people like clients. So the bizarre thing about interviews is, in interviews, employers tend to ask lots and lots of questions about the past, about what you've done in the past, and they're not really terribly interested in it. What really excites people at interviewers at interview is when talk turns around to the job and how the job might be done and what a particular person can bring to a job. And how you're going to do really well at an interview is if you can spend as much time as possible talking about the job and about how you would do it. And a good way of doing that is this technique here, is you give your answer and you finish it up with this statement. And I think what I've just been speaking about is important to this job because communication skills are a particularly important part of this job. And whatever that last bit after because is really comes from the job description, the person specification, what you understand they're looking for. So you're obviously trying to put yourself forward as somebody's very ideal. And what you're trying to do as far as possible is get them to identify what you've done in the past as transferable and relevant to this job. And this little statement at the end of your answers to questions, and I think what I've been speaking about is important to this job because communication skills, whatever it is important to this job, is a really useful way of doing that. And it's a really useful way of trying to get discussion going across the table about the job and about what they want done on the job. The next important thing, Shane, you might talk through, is silver bullets.
Sure. Silver bullets. Someone who knows the decision maker. Make sure that you try and find out who that is. The decision maker is going to be one of your interviewers, and they're going to be looking for certain criteria above all else. So it's important to try and figure out what that is. So you may speak to somebody who knows the organization. You may try and find out in the interview itself, try and find out from their body language, find out what they're looking for. It could be they're interested in time management, getting projects in on time. They could be more interested in your attention to detail and your accuracy. So speak to somebody that's been in there, speak to somebody that knows that the interviewer, find out what that key criteria is and use it to your advantage. Always try and get it into the answers that you're going to be replying in the interview itself.
Great, thanks, Shane. Now, the third point we're making before we go into the questions is think about value and the value that you can bring to the job, and particularly the additional value or something you have that maybe other people don't have. And what you're going to try and do at interview, and therefore in the answers that you provide to interviewers, you should try and convince them that you've got the ability to hit the ground running, do the job well from day one, that you're interested in the job and just personally suited to it. Really important at moving up into the next ground, the higher ground, moving from good to great. If you can demonstrate a good understanding of the nuances of the job and really what's involved in doing the job really, really well, how you can bring value of particular interest to the employer, and understand how the role can be developed. We're now going to go on to questions that are asked and how you might answer those questions. Shane, you might talk through these.
Yeah, so the type of questions that we're looking at, there'll be verification questions, exploring questions, probing questions, opinionated questions. You can see they all kind of lead into each other. Scenario, situations, conduct questions, behavioral questions, and mischievous questions.
Okay.
So the verification questions, this is basically, it'll all be coming from your CV. So they're basically looking for your credentials. So I see that you've worked in XYZ organization. It'll lead on to your experience. So while you were working there, you worked on conveyancing or you worked in tech law. And then they'll start verifying your knowledge within that area. So, you spent 2 years with X, Y, and Z working in conveyancing. What did you learn? So it's all leading on. It'll start off with yes or no answers and lead on to more expanded answers.
Great, great. Thanks, Shane. They tend to be the easiest questions you're going to be asked in an interview. The next easiest ones or whatever tend to be exploring questions. This is where they're teasing out the information you've given them on your CV or your application form. They're looking for a little bit more information. So they might ask you, what were your responsibilities in such and such a role? What are your strengths? What are your interests? What are your aspirations? That classic question, where do you want to be in 5 years' time? So these questions are all, what they're trying to do here is expand on the information that they've got from you so far and just trying to get a better all-round picture of you. One technique we propose you use on this, really useful, is this one that we just put up on the screen, where you explain what you're talking about and you provide examples. So I am conscientious. By that, nothing leaves my desk unless it's absolutely and utterly correct. An example of this is my boss has nicknamed me his QA department. So at the end of the interview, they say, Keith, who was he? What was he like? Oh, he's the QA department. Oh, yes. And so they remember you because of the stories that you tell about yourself, because people identify with stories. And they remember that you're conscientious because you told a story that demonstrated that with you being nicknamed a QA department. So this way of communicating works really, really well at interview. This way of answering questions, it works particularly well with that age-old question that you're almost always asked: what are your strengths? I am hardworking. By that I mean I don't leave something till I'm utterly, happy that it's finished. An example of that is I was complimented on this very matter at every annual review I've ever had in my working life. So I'm just going to go on. Sorry, to the next slide. Oh, yes. We're now into the really tough questions, okay? So we started with credential questions, verification questions, then exploring questions. And now we're talking about probing questions. And probing questions are the questions where they're digging down and they're saying, okay, well, we're particularly, they mightn't tell you, but because they're particularly interested in something, they want to know in depth about that. So that classic question, what exactly did you do regarding conveyancing? Or what exactly did you do in that big litigation case you handled? Did you brief counsel or did somebody else? The next three questions are very closely linked, and they tend to be asked of people who are might be considered a little bit overqualified for the job. So, that is reflected in the middle question there. Are you overqualified for this job? A similar kind of question as the one above. Prove to me that your interest is sincere, and also the one below, how do we know you're going to stay? If you're asked this question, it's really, really important that you get it right, because what you've got here is an employer who's interested in you. They're looking at a gift horse, and there's a certain amount of looking, at you in the mouth, and just hang on. You seem like a particular bargain. Are you not going to leave? After a short while. And the way you answer all these three questions, these probing questions, is the best way you can answer it is to say, well, let's look at the job and explain how the job might be done. And I tend to use the analogy of a receptionist. You say, if I take a job as a receptionist with you, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and I'm going to make sure these things work well. But I understand what's important to customers coming in, and I understand that the receptionist is the absolute primary ambassador of the hotel. They're the person who has most contact with most guests coming in. So if a guest comes in and they're going to be a few minutes, I look over the shoulder of the person I'm dealing with, and I say, it's going to be about 5 minutes, but there's a bathroom over there, and there's a games room over there, or whatever. And when they do come to me, I do the various business with them, but I also then take a moment to say, by the way, there's a hairdresser's on the third floor, and the dining room over here does a particularly a good value meal, early bird meal between 5 and 7. So the receptionist is a huge is so well placed to sell other services of the hotel. Now, I don't see that as being some kind of a small, unimportant job. I think that there's a huge opportunity within this job. And a nice way to finish up on these kind of questions is to say, I don't see myself as overqualified. I see myself as better qualified. So these are really, useful questions that if you're in a situation where an employer is interested in you, but they're a little bit concerned that will you stay, or will the job be enough? The important thing here is you have to understand the job. You have to understand how you can go in, do this job, and how you can add value to it and make the job into something more than maybe even the interviewers had expected. The last question is one is in my view the toughest question you can be asked at an interview. Why should we hire you? So Shane, we're seeing 6 people today. Why should we hire you? So it's a cut to the chase question. It's there's lots of fluffy stuff, whatever. But now we're asking you why you, and what you need to use here is a silver bullet. You can, in your answer, you can start off with some fluffy stuff or whatever. But what you need to do is you need to hit them with something that's particularly important to them. So if the decision maker has expressed huge interest in attention to detail and getting things absolutely right and making sure that nothing goes out without errors on it. You say, I can do this, this, and this, but most important of all, I am a stickler for detail and accuracy, and nothing is going to leave my desk unless it's 100% right. So that's how you answer that last question, and we're going to come back to that question before the end of this webinar. Shane.
Opinion questions. Just on those probing questions, that best qualified rather than overqualified is a fantastic line. I've come across that quite a bit, so it's a great one to use. Opinion questions. So that's when the interview is looking for your opinion on the company, or any of the companies that you've worked for, the industry itself. So it can be clients of the company, the accounts that you've worked on, who you're reporting to. Something similar to, oh, I believe you've worked in X, Y, and Z. Who are you reporting to in there? How did you find it? Don't fall into the trap. Always be positive. So we're looking for positivity on the profession, on social and political ideas, opinions, and your values itself. So always express optimism and be positive, basically.
Great, thank you. We have people watching, and there isn't a questions facility, but if you do want to ask a question, you can use the chat facility. The only thing is, I would say to you, if you use the chat facility, just be aware that your name is going to come up on the screen and everybody's going to see it. So we love to get questions for you or any kind of feedback, but just be, and that is done through the chat facility. But if you do send us a chat, your name is going to be seen by everybody attending. Thank you, Shane. Let's go on to the next one. Scenario questions. Scenario questions, these are the questions where a situation is outlined and you're asked to advise. So the best way to approach these questions is to sit back a little bit and be considerate and act like a consultant and ask lots of questions. So they ask you the question and then you ask a few clarifying questions that give you a steer. The important thing with these questions is don't rush to judgment and don't feel under any pressure to provide some kind of a quick solution or anything else like that. Much, much better to consider things and to discuss things in a lateral way. Try and get discussion going across the table. Ask them questions and hopefully they'll, as they start to give you information, then, you might say something back and they might then respond to you again. And before you know it, you've got discussion going across the table. They're helping you answer the question. And that's when this kind of answer has worked out really well. And it's important that you show enjoyment in these questions, so as I said, sit back, relax, yeah, that's really interesting, really nice to demonstrate ease and assuredness with these questions, because what they're looking for, particularly if you're going forward for a job as a solicitor, they're looking for somebody who can handle being asked about complex matters and being given a lot of detail and making sense of it and coming up with some kind of a guidance. The next one is conduct. Shane, you might talk us through conduct questions.
Sure, conduct questions. Basically, conduct questions are when you're being asked about being faced with a dilemma at work. So it's often involving a colleague. So how would you deal with a poor performer, something like that. So they're trying to put you into a situation and want to find out how you would deal with it. It's important to be very, very slow on this. Don't rush to judgment. Don't give an immediate response. Find out what rules are in place and rely on that. So a typical answer would be that I presume that there is an employee handbook. First thing I do is take direction from that. Secondly, take direction from somebody above you, so your manager or somebody above that. Basically, that's it. So refer to the rules in place and take your direction from authority.
Great, thanks, Shane. Behavioural questions. We say here these are very closely aligned to competency questions. And the reason for that is competency questions are always behavioural questions. With the competency interview, as we talked about last week, what the employer does is they identify certain things, certain attributes that are absolutely important to have in the job, and they then ask you questions about them. And the way that the questions they ask are always behavioural questions. Teamwork is an important part of this job. Can you talk us through some time when you were particularly, you did demonstrated capability in the area of teamwork? So all competency questions are behavioral, but there are other questions that are not necessarily competency questions that are also behavioral. So you may be asked a question about something that is not utterly and absolutely necessary for the job, but maybe the company has a particular interest in it. We're going to be involved doing a lot of fundraising over the next few months in our part-time here within the firm. Have you any experience of fundraising? I've noted down some other questions here. What do you like at leading a team? It mightn't teamwork mightn't be an absolute competency in the job, but it's a casual inquiry. Or have you ever had to deal with an emergency in work? That doesn't reflect any particular capability, but it's about an experience. In all of these questions, you answer the same way as you answer within a competency question, and that is you use at the very most basic the STAR framework: situation you found yourself in, the task you were faced with, the action you took, and the result you got. If you watch the competency webinar we did last week, our recommendation is you extend that out. You start with an introduction and you end with a note about relevance. So what we're saying is, if you're asked behavioral questions, start with an introduction that says, yes, I have good experience in leading a team, and then you go through the STAR framework. You describe a situation, a task you found yourself in, the action you took, the result you got, and you say, and you know, this I think is really important or relevant to this job, because I think in this job, teamwork and the ability to get the best out of a team is really critical. And so you finish by, as I just did there, referring back to the job and the needs of the job. And you pick that up, of course, as we said earlier, from the job description and person specification. Mischievous questions. These questions are asked for different reasons. A little bit, sometimes they want to rock your cage and see what happens, okay? So the purpose is to see what you like under pressure. They're very unusual questions. They don't get asked much, and they particularly don't get asked much of solicitors by other solicitors. But if you are asked one, take your time. And a good technique is to use some clarifying questions that gives you time to think, and it also opens up everybody's understanding of what they're talking about. So our next slide, we actually give some recommendations if you are asked this question, but I think it's important to say that you probably won't be asked this question at an interview. So, mischievous answer. If you're asked a mischievous question, for example, how long will it take a double-decker bus to get to the moon? A good strategy is to lean back in the chair, look down your nose, laugh, or at least chuckle. Look the person squarely in the eye and say, that's an interesting question. And what you're doing there is you're letting them know that they haven't upset you, and you're letting yourself know that you're not upset. That's an interesting question. And then ask them one or two questions that, maybe tease out things a little bit more. Would the bus be picking up passengers along the way? Would the bus have to stop for diesel along the way? And then all the time you're trying to yourself figure out, okay, how can I answer this? But the important thing to do is don't panic. The whole point of this question is they're watching to see how you behave under pressure. So personally, if it was me, I'd make a guess in terms of how far the moon is away. I'd say, well, I think the moon is about 500,000 miles away. If it's 500,000 miles away, and I'd explain, well, I believe the moon is about 500,000 miles away. A bus travels about 50 miles an hour. So that would be 100,000 hours, wouldn't it? And that's your answer to the question. Now, you could be way off, but it doesn't matter. You haven't panicked. You haven't, fallen to the ground and rolled up in a ball and started to cry or anything else like that. So what you need to do with these questions is handle yourself in a confident way. Shane, you were going to talk through the last point, but if you don't mind, as I'm on a bit of a roll, I'll do it if that's all right.
Absolutely, fire ahead.
Great. Okay. There's one last question we thought we should handle as an individual separate question on its own. And it's that one where they say, okay, well, we've asked everything we wanted to. Have you got any questions? And here, coming back to that really tough question, which is why you? You really need to make sure that you answer that question before you leave an interview. And we incorporated into what you say when you're asked this question. Have you got any questions for us? Our suggestion is you say, yes, but can I first say, it's been really nice meeting you, John, Maria, Chair, and having talked to you about the job, I have to say I'm really interested in it, and I believe I could fit in well, could make a big contribution, particularly in the area of boom, and you hit them with the silver bullet. You hit them with what you believe is the most important silver bullet. So I believe I can fit in, I can make a valuable contribution, particularly in the area of attention to detail and accuracy. And yes, I do have a question, and you then open up a little notebook that you've brought in, which on one page, a single page, you've written about 5 or 6 questions, and you'll find that some of these questions will be answered. So you'll say, well, we answered that, we answered that. Yes, here's an interesting question. And you ask, you know, is there a plan in place to settle the person in when they go into the job? You clearly shouldn't ask questions about, you know, what are the holidays, or, you know, is there sick leave, what's the sick leave entitlement to in the job? Anything that involves the employer having to give you something, you know, this is not a good time to ask about it. So ask innocuous kind of questions. You know, you might ask about, is there any study that you would expect or hope that the appointee would take on over the next few years? As I said, is there a plan of induction for the person going in the job? One particularly useful question here, it's a cheeky kind of a question, is to say, can I ask you, what's the difference between this job being done okay and this job being done really, really well? And what you're forcing them to do in that is to spend most of the time, of course, talking about how the job might be done really, really well. And so you're ending on a nice positive note. And all you have to do, of course, is sit back and nod and say, yeah, well, that's exactly what I do. That's exactly what I do. So it's a nice way to end. So they're all answers to that final question that people have grief with. But the most important thing to do is to have a number of questions, because invariably you'll find that, you know, if you go in with one question expecting to answer, it happens to be covered halfway through the interview. And a good way of having 5 or 6 questions is to jot them down in a nice, neat little notebook and just bring that notebook in. Of course, the other thing that you're going to bring in for interview are a few copies of your CV, just in case somebody on the other side of the table doesn't have one. That's the end of this. Is there anything else, Shane, you wanted to add?
No, basically just enjoy yourself. Even though you may be nervous, just tell yourself that you're enjoying this, and make them believe that you're enjoying this. Be positive, smile.
Great. And if you want any help, if you find yourself facing an interview, particularly video interviews, which are, you know, people are being asked about, what you might do is give us a shout at any time, and we can give you support. In fact, I'm just thinking, Shane, I think what we'll do is we'll do one on video interviews next week, next Wednesday. So we were planning to do 3, but I think it would be a good idea to do a 4th one on videos by Zoom and video. Is that
Perfect.
okay?
Sounds good. Yeah.
Great. So we're going to do that, and we hope you join us next week. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.